Okay, now we move on to our second major 17th century figure, and that is the figure of Thomas Hobbes, who has been a source of something like delight for many philosophers for centuries. We'll hopefully discover why. So I title this lecture Thomas Hobbes, Materialist Philosophy and Political Leviathan. Leviathan is a figure from the Bible, and that was his chosen, as it were, figure and metaphor for what he called commonwealth. And he tries to describe for us our desperate need, um, rooted in our nature, for a commonwealth that can establish peace, security, and the bare possibility of prosperity and comfort. And we'll see why he argues that way. So, before we talk about Hobbes directly, we should make a couple of transition points concerning Descartes so we can finish him up and move right to Hobbes. So, what are the big takeaways from Descartes? Number one, I want you to preserve your recognition of Cartesian dualism. Now, recall, in antiquity, the big distinction was between being and becoming. With St. Augustine, being became identified with the Creator and God, and becoming became identified with his creature, right, in the realm of time. Okay, in Descartes, he digs down to the very fundament of human conception, and he introduces a different basic opposition. Now he still has the distinction between being and becoming, as it were. He doesn't use the word becoming, um, but rather than make that the basic opposition for organizing um, his entire philosophy, all of his other concepts, he makes the distinction between mind as extensionless substance and matter as extended substance as his basic distinction. Okay, and that more or less introduces the modern epoch philosophically. Second, he puts forward the ideal of a mathesis universalis, a universal method for all of the sciences, okay, with one mathematical calculus that can be used for all of them. Now, that didn't quite work. I mean, the closest we get to that today, I guess would be calculus, right? Because the devices of the calculus are used in numerous areas, but that's scarcely the calculus is scarcely sufficient, right, for conducting the various branches of science. So he put forward the idea. It didn't quite work out, but it was a fruitful idea in that in pursuing it, many branches of mathematics were subsequently discovered. Third, the one that we talked about quite a lot, he established the program of technology along with Francis Bacon, that is becoming masters and possessors of nature, which is, as I read it, I think inevitably you have to understand that as our species launching a campaign against God to take his possession from him and to submit that possession, that is the material cosmos, to our power and to compel that possession, now made our possession, at least according to Descartes' ambition, to do what we wanted to do. We're going to appropriate it to our desires and satisfy them. It just in the background of this, you can see a desire for immortality, right? And as you are quite well aware, people have been working on the idea of immortality, first longevity, but possibly immortality, really since the inception of the program of technology. Finally, the consequence of Descartes is that he gives birth to two different traditions. Now, he's not responsible for Hobbes because they were contemporaries, but um, because Descartes produced his philosophy, we get two streams from him. One is what we call British empiricism. That's Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and they tend to emphasize the materialist side. Well, materialist isn't quite the right word, but they tend to emphasize the sphere of consciousness. Let's put it that way: the sphere of consciousness, the sphere of the mind. And then there's continental rationalism, and Descartes is usually actually included in the list of continental rationalists. So that's Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. And these persons are associated with a priori reasoning, right? And we saw that Descartes does engage in a priori reasoning, but he does so while also setting up the Cartesian theater of consciousness, which then becomes the kind of site for a rich tradition of philosophizing in Great Britain. Okay, so at that time it wasn't Great Britain, right? The Act of Union doesn't come until 1707. Hume was a Scotsman. Berkeley was an Irishman, Locke was an Englishman. So it's anachronistic to call it Great Britain, but it would become that. So here, let's talk about Hobbes' life and accomplishments. Hobbes was born in 1588, the year the English defeated the Spanish Armada, and he died in 1679, 10 years prior to the conclusion of the Glorious Revolution, which permanently installed Protestant-led government in England and subsequently Great Britain. Now, Hobbes maintained that he was born prematurely due to his mother's great fear of the coming invasion by the Spanish Armada under Philip II. In fact, many had prophesied that 1588 would mark the end of the world. And this view was backed by numbers drawn from the book of the Apocalypse, from the book of Daniel, and from Isaiah. So Western civilization, since the establishment of Christianity as its religion, with, let's say, Christian Rome, and that happens, depending upon the historian you talk to, either in 381 or 390 AD. Christian civilization has been marked by an apocalyptic consciousness, right? And the anticipation of the end of the world. So people have been speculating about that for the past 2,000 years. And I think it's fair to say every generation thinks that, their generation is the last one. The end of the world is coming. And so you'll find books published, all the time. Every year you'll find a book published interpreting various scriptures, trying to explain to you that we are right now at the beginning of the process of the end of the world. And people are talking that way right now because of the potential for the expansion of conflict in the Middle East, because some persons speculate that, or they claim they have footage to the effect that many persons who cross the southern border were actually trained military men. I can't speak for it or against it, but they claim that's the case. So that, there's a kind of occupying power already in the United States, has been paid for by someone or other in order to overthrow our country. Persons have claimed that the COVID event was more or less arranged, and that the COVID vaccine is a poison, and it was deliberately injected into the veins of persons who are fanatical, how to put it, they're concerned with overpopulation, right? So, I mean, there's all this kind of speculation out there. Whatever you make of it, I'm neither endorsing it nor criticizing it. There's all this speculation out there. So our time is no different from any previous time. Okay, so, but perhaps one can say that not the world, but a world ended in July of 1588. The world of Catholic England, what had been described as its peculiar merry quality. I'm not the only person to have noted this, right? I'm taking these ideas from historians, really. What followed was perhaps a more dour, severe, melancholic, and even wrathful English society. You think about the wrath of the Puritans and the decapitation of King Charles I, right? So however one describes the transition, there was indeed a fundamental transformation. So Thomas Hobbes, having entered the world due to the apocalyptic fear of his mother, by his own account, apparently she corroborated this story, he probably got it from her, he came to base his moral and political philosophy on that very passion, as we will see, the passion of fear. And he described fear as his twin, born with him out of the womb of his mother. Okay. So further events during Hobbes' life. The most important event of Hobbes' life was undoubtedly the English Civil War, not the Glorious Revolution, the Civil War, which raged between King Charles I and Parliament between 1641 and 1651. This war ended, as I said, with the execution of King Charles by Parliament. This would be as if the U.S. Congress ordered and itself carried out the execution of Joe Biden or Donald Trump when he was in power. Only it would have been regarded at that time as worse than our Congress killing a president, as the king was thought to be appointed by God himself. Right? Once in a while you can find a pastor here or there who thinks the president is chosen by God. I guess that's sort of standard Christian theology. God's in control of everything, right? So of course he's in control of who becomes president. But that idea is only more pronounced in monarchies, where a monarchy, the monarch has a particular divine mandate. He receives the chrism, right, and is marked with a particular charism of holiness and power to lead his people wisely, right? So they would have regarded this, and did regard it as, well, many of them regarded it as an assault upon God Almighty. Then Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan, assumed in effect dictatorial power. That wasn't his original idea, but that's what happened. So the experience of war was a second factor confirming Hobbes' conviction that fear is the fundamental passion and the key to understanding both human nature and to establishing a just commonwealth. Okay, some biographical remarks and some effort at trying to get some insight into Hobbes' psychology. Now, the arguments either work or don't work independently of his psychology, but it's interesting to have those psychological accounts. So it is for his political philosophy, as recorded in his book, The Leviathan, that Hobbes is justly famous. If he didn't publish the Leviathan, he would not be really taught today in philosophy departments. So he'd be the concern of specialists. He was very famous at his time, prior to Leviathan, but yeah, there were a lot of other very famous people at that time who today are not really taught or read. So I want to introduce you to the relationship between Hobbes and Niccolo Machiavelli. And Niccolo Machiavelli is another figure who lived in the 15th and was active in the 16th century in Italy. And he was a diplomat for the city of Florence and was removed from power when, well, he worked for the Florentine Republic. And when the Medici returned to power, he was removed, and then he was accused of conspiring to overthrow the Medici and put in a dungeon and tortured, and then sent into exile. And he was sent into exile, not killed, because one of the Medici became Pope. And so clemency was granted to all those in prison. But it was required that he remain in the countryside. So there he went to farm. And apparently he was no good at it, but good enough, not to starve to death. And so he wrote a couple of books, one called The Discourses on Livy, which I can recommend, and a second called The Prince. And in The Prince, they're both based on the same conceptual scheme, but in The Prince, he draws a fundamental distinction between those who desire to command and oppress, first bullet point there, and those who desire merely not to be commanded or oppressed. Okay? You get that? Ask yourself, do you want to, occupy political office? Then from Machiavelli's point of view, you belong to the group of people who basically are ambitious. Now, he has a rather a kind of snazzy way of putting it, saying that you desire to command and oppress people. I doubt that you do, but you do want to occupy a position of authority, and you want to exercise that authority if you're that kind of person. And that's the majority of people, right? That's maybe like 2% of the population or something, 3%, whatever. And then maybe 5%, who knows? But the vast majority, at least 90% to 95%, desire merely not to be commanded and oppressed. They want you to leave them alone. They want to be able to have their background barbecues and their Super Bowl parties, right? And to enjoy life without the government interfering with them and getting in their way, making onerous demands of them, taxing them into the ground, and so on and so forth. Okay. So the point is that Hobbes studied Machiavelli. He picked up this particular distinction, and he's going to develop it in his worldview and his political philosophy in particular. So the first group, those who desire to command and oppress. By the way, Machiavelli was replacing Plato and Aristotle's distinction between the wise and the unwise. For Plato and Aristotle, the fundamental distinction to pay attention to when constructing a political philosophy is that distinction between the wise and the unwise. For Machiavelli, that's wrong. What we need to recognize is the distinction between the ambitious and the unambitious. That's what's really, at bottom, relevant. Okay, so the first group, the ambitious, are motivated by honor, or what Hobbes calls vainglory. They demand definite signs of their superiority over others. Okay? Christianity, which teaches gentleness, tenderness of affection, sacrificial love, and the like, charges them with pride. Okay? So the second group are motivated by the desire for comfortable self-preservation. Think of this second group as those who desire merely not to be inferior to the mass of their fellows. They don't, have to think of themselves as particularly superior, but they don't want to be held in contempt, right? So human experience teaches us that there is actually a third category that neither Hobbes nor Machiavelli mentioned, but we should mention it simply to recognize the fact that they're deliberately passing it over in silence, right? And this is those who desire neither superiority with the first category nor equality with the second category. Rather pursue a more and more perfect consciousness of two things. First, the degree to which sin has made them wretched. Second, the inexhaustible ocean of divine mercy. There's not a small number of these people historically either, particularly as you go back in history. Maybe fewer today because it's emphasized less, but for centuries, everybody was a Christian, so you have a larger number of persons who would fit into this third category. So this group would prefer to actually suffer for Christ as a confirmation and seal of their devotion to him than to seek the consolations of the world. So Hobbes doesn't mention this third category. I'm suggesting this is part of his sort of cooperation with Descartes and Bacon in trying to redirect European civilization in a different direction. Okay. Now, Hobbes does treat Christianity in parts 3 and 4 of his Leviathan, but the treatment there is made in light of the distinction drawn by Machiavelli, while the reality of saintly persons is passed over again in silence. His interpretation of Scripture, if you look at it, is likewise peculiarly materialist in his basic premises. So, in a word, Hobbes continued what I'll call the revolt against Christianity, begun by Machiavelli and continued by Bacon and Descartes, which has continued to the present day, and is nearly complete. So Hobbes' transformation of a Christian society. Now, one can advance the following thesis. Hobbes probably thought that Machiavelli went too far in suggesting, however indirectly, the overthrow of Christianity. I can't prove this to you. When I teach social and political philosophy, I go into the texts and try to demonstrate this over a period of about 2 weeks. In its place, I suggest he adopted the strategy of changing Christian doctrine so as to de-emphasize. This is a rhetorical exercise in de-emphasizing reference to heaven, hell, the end times, and all things otherworldly, in favor of what one might call golden rule Christianity. When Pope Francis appeared in front of the U.S. Congress, and he said, "Do unto others as you would have others do unto you, and do not do unto others as you would not have others do unto you." Right? Golden rule Christianity, which would serve well as a civil religion, right? A religion, the purpose of which is to serve the ends of the state and the ends of human life. Okay, so in effect, he is trying to turn people away from thinking continuously about the fate of one's eternal soul in favor of more or less reducing Christianity, if you like, to the 10 Commandments and the Golden Rule, which are excellent to adhere to, right? If your aim is to live peaceably with your neighbor. If everybody adhered to the 10 Commandments, there'd be no problem, right? There'd be no murder, there'd be no theft, there'd be no adultery. Therefore, there'd be no divorce motivated by adultery, right? People would keep up the observance of religion, at least externally, and all that bad stuff. There wouldn't even be slandering of your neighbor. I mean, all that would vanish. So call this the Romanizing of Christianity, in the sense of making it more like pagan Rome, taking this otherworldly religion oriented towards heaven, one's true home, right, according to Christian doctrine, and reducing that, minimizing that, and making it into a civil religion. I think that's what Hobbes is doing. So here are some basic features of his philosophy. Materialism. Hobbes represents a resurgence of ancient Epicureanism. So he himself taught that reality is atoms in the void. And so this is Epicurus and ultimately Democritus roaring back. And if you like Parmenides, you remember that Parmenides, he set the table with the problem of that that lecture didn't get recorded, but you have the document. So Parmenides established the problem of being, that there is being and there is non-being. Non-being is utterly unintelligible. Being alone is intelligible. Okay, and then Democritus says, well, being is effectively um, a basic, absolutely small unit of existence called the atom, and there's an infinite number of them, and they move around in non-being space, right? So Hobbes picks up that distinction and says that's actually the truth. So there you go. Here's that old tradition lying dormant for what, at this point, nearly 2,000 years. 2,000 years, okay? And it gets resuscitated and becomes part of the New World view. Well, New World views, because there's a few that are being bandied about at this time historically, but one that would bear fruit in the development of modern science. Okay? Now, what if you were to write a book, and a darn good book, but people ignored it, and then someone picked it up 2,000 years from now and made a whole new civilization out of it? Okay, it would be something like that. That's what happened here. So, another feature of Hobbes' philosophy is egoism. So, a voluntary, he writes, these are his words, of voluntary actions of every man, the object is some good to himself, not somebody else. Okay? This is really a doctrine concerning motivation. For the egoist, a person can only be motivated by a desire or appetite for some good for himself, and never simply for the sake of another's good. Okay? So egoism, we should add, just to be thorough here, egoism, psychological egoism is what this is the opposite of psychological altruism. And that's the doctrine that one can be motivated by the desire for another's good. So with egoists, there's one motivation, your own good. With altruism, there are two possible motivations, either your own good or somebody else's good, right? They just add or somebody else's good, and that's the whole difference. And I would add this, since we're talking about it, there's this thing I would call communitarianism, and that is that one can be motivated by a desire for the good of a community of which one is a member, okay? And normally, if one benefits a community of which one is a member, one draws some good from that community which one has benefited. But that doesn't make it egoism, because one can benefit a community by sacrificing one's life, right? And that's not mere altruism either, because one can benefit the community and receive benefit in turn. Okay. So the third basic feature of his philosophy is what he puts forward as a kind of mathematical method. He doesn't actually follow it, but he at least articulates it and champions it. So science should model itself on geometrical demonstration from definitions. He spent a lot of time trying to square the circle. No mathematician has ever done that, and we can venture to say no mathematician ever will. By now, there may be a proof that can't be done. I think there is, but I can't remember who did it. So nominalism, that's the doctrine that there are no real universals, and that what is common to many particulars is merely a name. Tree, dog. Now, I mentioned William of Ockham earlier in the course. He's the originator of the philosophy of nominalism. Okay? All right. Many persons in the Thomist camp blame Ockham for having taken a wrecking ball right through European philosophy. So, Hobbes' rejection of the school philosophy. Okay, so what's this? That's basically Thomism and Scotism. I mentioned Duns Scotus. And Duns Scotus got play in England particularly because, well, he was as today we say, he was British. He was a Scotsman, obviously. Hence we call him Scotus. So Hobbes accuses both of being pure nonsense. A case in point is the locution incorporeal substance, which he believes to be self-contradictory. Now, this is actually not a very popular position today, as nearly every philosopher admits the existence of what we call abstract objects like numbers and concepts. So these are incorporeal, they're immaterial. right? Whether they're substances or not is a matter of dispute, but at least they're immaterial. So if those are immaterial, then there's nothing barring the way in principle against an incorporeal substance, if you guys follow me. Since we have so much time, or put so much time into it, note the following. I think actually we put so much time into Thomas's theory of analogy that you have a pretty good grasp of that. If you really want to review it, hit pause, just read those numbers there. Otherwise, I'm just going to move on because I think we put 3 or 4 slides into that, so I'm not going to bother doing it again. So, philosophical psychology. Hobbes argues, like Aquinas, that all knowledge is derived from sensation. But he goes further in maintaining that our sensations of things are results of mechanical forces, sending motions from things into our bodies and terminating at the brain and heart, each of which resists the pressure put upon it. The result of this resistance to external pressure, a slight pushing back, as it were, that result is sensation, right? So there's pressure being placed upon your brain and your heart. He thought of the heart as a sensory organ, and there's resistance, and that kind of ratio, that tension, that results generates sensation. So you might not find that convincing, but that's what he thought. So imagination. What's imagination? That's the lingering of sensations after the moment of impact and the diminution of their intensity. Okay? So there was that tension, right? And then the whatever it is that caused the tension departed, like you turned around, stopped looking at the tree. But there's still, as it were, kind of agitation in your heart or your brain. And only now it's fading, right? So an act of the imagination is a somewhat weaker after effect of sensation. Memory and imagination are in fact the same exact thing, but they're being described from 2 different points of view. All right, next. Understanding, by which Hobbes means judgment and reasoning, which we're very familiar with, is but a certain development of the imagination by means of language, which distinguishes us from brute beasts. But language comes with a pitfall, namely that it allows our species to produce nonsense, incorporeal substance, from Hobbes' point of view, which a mere animal cannot do. Okay, so the advantage of being a beaver is that you cannot produce nonsense. Philosophical Psychology, Part 2. His philosophy of language is actually integral to his psychology. And you have psychologists obviously studying language, it's not just linguists. He stutters, he understands he understands naming as an act of assigning an arbitrary sound to a thing or concept. Names are marks to aid a speaker's memory. That's number 1. And they are also signs to another of a speaker's thoughts. So you name things and you use those to preserve memories of things. So it's not enough to have a fading image in virtue of a sense impression, as a later philosopher would call it. You also want to fix those, nail them down, right, by talking about them and preserving statements that you produce about them. And those statements are more apt to be remembered because the words that you have are part of your permanent vocabulary, right? Whereas the experience, there was nothing permanent about it. It came and it went. So you organize those tokens or those signs, which are part of your permanent or semi-permanent vocabulary. One can forget words too. And those enable you to fix something in memory. Then when you speak to another person, you're giving that person a sign of what you're thinking about. Like I'm doing right now. There's all sorts of stuff going on in my mind which you can't access directly, so I have to speak. Wouldn't my job be easy if I could just sit here and just kind of transmit the thoughts to you without speaking? So it's an act of communication that conveys these thoughts via names to another. This act of conveying meaning is what Hobbes calls signification, not the same thing as naming. Okay, naming is establishing a relationship between a sound or written set of figures and a thing, and signification is an act of conveying meanings, thus conveying to another person what you're thinking. So finally, Hobbes, of course, was a nominalist who taught that only names are universal. So his philosophy of language and his theory of particularity and universality intersect here. Okay, Hobbes also has a peculiar stance he takes on religion. It doesn't take much to see in Hobbes a kind of skepticism towards all religion. All right. And that would bolster my interpretation of Hobbes as effectively a kind of critic of Christianity, but one who is subtle enough to realize he's not going to, he's not going to get English civilization of 17th century England to just give up their religion. It's not going to happen. I mean, it's not even happening today. I mean, I was saying that we're in the final stages of the destruction of Christianity. That's true enough. But there are still millions of Christians out there, and you literally have to kill them. Yeah, they're not going to give it up. So Hobbes understood that of his contemporaries, and so that's why he's trying to reinterpret Christianity to make it amenable to his own designs for English society. Anyway, so now he also gives us an origin of religion, which will bolster what I just said. He puts forward an influential way of understanding religion and what he calls superstition. So we're beginning to see this idea of superstition. Religion is simply whatever political authority allows to be practiced. But superstition, that's just what political authority forbids. Okay, a purely stipulatory and positive, not positive in the sense of good, but positive in the sense of positing as a matter of human will, theory of religion. So ideally, the political authority should establish only one church, because, as he says, you can only serve one master. Or I'll put it differently: you cannot serve two masters. He's quoting Jesus there, isn't he? Right? You can't serve two masters, both God and Mammon. And he would say you can't serve two masters, both the emperor and the pope, or both the emperor and whatever religious figure. You get that? He might even say, now, this will help my interpretation, you can't serve two masters, both the emperor or the king and God. So for Hobbes will assign the authority of determining what God says to the king or the queen, the sovereign. He or she, and she's in play here because of Queen Elizabeth, right? He or she has the authority to interpret the Bible for you. Okay? And once he or she interprets the Bible for you, and normally that's delegated to a bishop, once one of the kings or queens delegates to the bishop and then puts his or her seal of approval on the interpretation, that's it. You're bound. That's how Hobbes thinks about this. And that way you will not serve two masters, you'll serve one. So he defines religion, look at this, as fear of things invisible, and that of those who worship. That of those who worship as I do. So it's my fear of things invisible and their fear of things invisible. And that's holy fear of God. Fear not him who can destroy the body, but him who can destroy the body and soul as well, right? So it's right there in Scripture. So obviously this is a pretty loose definition of religion. It doesn't refer to anything, like organized worship and glorifying God, so on and so forth. So it's almost like he's like advertising his contempt for the entire sphere of religion, all religions, and wants you to know it, which is a dangerous thing for him to do in the 17th century. And he did get himself into a bit of hot water, but he always managed to. He was a very clever man. They talked to him about this. He always managed to kind of sidestep any heat he might have otherwise received. So he finds the origin of religion. Let's talk about this. The origin of religion. Where does it come from for a man like Hobbes? He'll try to explain where it comes from. Let's go. I mean, it's sort of interesting. It's a very interesting question. I mean, it's not sort of interesting. It's a fascinating question. But it's interesting particularly because there are so many different sorts of religion. So they can't all be true, right? You follow me? At most, one is true. So then we have to get an account of where all these other religions came from. Let's find out. So he finds the origin of religion in the effort on the part of human beings to find causes for the effects they experience. Okay. So the chief motivation is to find the causes of evil things and of good things. Okay, so this seems to be a philosophy of increasing control over things, right? But without science, this is the difficulty. Success in this endeavor is limited, right? If you don't have a scientific method, a disciplined way of approaching the study of nature and the study of cause and effect, you're not going to make much headway. Maybe a little bit. Sometimes you'll enjoy a little good luck, but in general, you're not going to reduce things to a science. So what happens is that humans invent the existence of invisible powers so they can grant themselves an illusory sense of security. What does that consist in? They think to themselves that they have a source of appeal now, right? They can appeal for help, or if things are going badly, they think, well, the gods are angry, so they can appease them, right? In good times, you appeal for help. In bad times, you appease the wrath of the gods. That's the idea. So to this, humans add assigning significance to things that arbitrarily accompany other things. Okay? So, for example, the appearance of a comet prior to a great calamity. So a comet shows up and then there's an earthquake. So people then say that comets portend doom, right, or catastrophe. So every time a comet appears in the future, they just all just start preparing for some sort of doom. Okay, and that's that. Or another one, they would kill a chicken, take the guts out, throw it on the ground. They still do this, and look at the arrangement of the guts and use that to decide whether or not to go to war or not, right? That sort of thing. So religion is held to consist. That's manifestly superstitious, right? I think we can agree on that. That's manifestly superstitious. For Hobbes, that would be religion if the state endorsed it. Okay, so in ancient Greece, that was religious. Here it's superstitious. In ancient Greece, if they got wind of Christianity, they would have thought it was superstitious because it would have been outlawed, right? And their own pagan religion would have been religion. Okay, but that, I mean, that's I'm not endorsing Hobbes' way of accounting for religion. I think I don't subscribe to his philosophy, but that's how he would think about it. That's what I'm trying to get across. Okay, so religion is held to consist in four things. Look at this: belief in ghosts. Okay, ignorance of secondary causes. Secondary causes are natural causes and effects. Primary cause would be God's creative act. So he's conforming to that, that school, that Thomist vocabulary. He does that from time to time in order to cover himself. Third, devotion to the spirits feared. And fourth, the taking of arbitrary connections as prognosticating future events. All right, that's all in chapter 12 of his Leviathan, if you're interested in that. He goes on further in there and has a very interesting account of, what causes people to revolt against a church. And you have priests who counsel that you act a certain way, and they're not acting that way, right? And second, it becomes evident that they are living the high life, okay? And third, they can't even agree on what they're teaching because one person publishes a work of theology that says A, B, and C, and another person publishes a work of theology that says D, E, and F, and they contradict one another, right? And you have that combination of selfishness and hypocrisy and the obvious lack of wisdom because they obviously don't know what they're talking about. I mean, this is Hobbes describing this now, right? He's being as severe as a person can be. And that leads to civil war. And so he places the responsibility for the civil war, he says, at the feet of displeasing priests. So he accuses effectively the Anglicans. Remember, the Church of England was dominant at that moment, 1641. So he places the responsibility for the civil war, it would seem, at the foot of the Anglicans. Okay, had they not been so displeasing, there wouldn't have been Puritans, and it was the Puritans who entered into an antagonistic relationship with Charles I. So you can't really think about politics unless you think about religion and do so very seriously. I'll endorse that. I agree with Hobbes on that one. It's impossible to think about politics in anything resembling a precise way, unless you take into account the religious beliefs of the people who participate in politics, because these beliefs actually motivate actions one way as opposed to another. That's just how it is. Okay, so political philosophy, let's make the transition there. So Hobbes argued for what we might term, this is my term now, he didn't use this expression, liberal autocracy. Liberal autocracy. What's liberal? That means you have the freedom to set up your own business, to pursue your desires, to pursue and accumulate property. And then later, with Thomas Jefferson, we could say to pursue happiness. Okay. Autocracy, that has the refers to the rule of one person, a dictator, or in this case, a king, a sovereign, or queen. Okay. Notice that liberal in the Hobbist context, not Hobbit, Hobbist, liberal in the Hobbist context does not refer to freedom of religion. It's basically economic freedom. So you have economic freedom wedded to a monarchy. All right. So he argues for liberal autocracy in which people enjoy greater comfortable self-preservation, and in which the monarch gets what he wants. That's more wealth through taxing them, and a strong army by drafting their sons. So we're sort of win-win. We'll come back to that. By the way, I'll mention to you that there is no distinction between a monarch and a tyrant for Hobbes. A tyrant is simply a monarch, a legitimate monarch who people don't like. So they just kind of insult him and call him a tyrant. But he occupies his position with absolute right, and one would be unjust to attempt to overthrow that person. That's how Hobbes looks at it. We'll see why. So the monarch belongs to the category of those who seek vainglory, those who want to dominate and oppress, right? While the people, they belong to the second category. They're timid, and they wish neither to be dominated nor oppressed. Okay. But these two categories of person, they can enter into a mutually beneficial, as we today say, symbiotic relationship. So we have to now explain the argument that he uses to justify this conception. So his argument begins in Leviathan 13. That's sort of the classic chapter. 13 and 14, those two. If you want to just read, I assigned them, right? So his argument begins in Leviathan 13, where he argues for two different sorts of equality. I think they don't have 14 in your book, but you should read it. First, there is, despite initial appearances to the contrary, listen to this, a natural physical equality that obtains between all human beings. Okay, so there's a natural physical equality between you and Shaquille O'Neal. And you're saying, no way. Okay, so he's not stupid, so we have to ask, how does he justify this claim? So the justification consists in the fact that everyone is equally vulnerable to suffering a violent death. That's why. You get that? Size and strength are irrelevant here. When all or many go about armed, or somebody using stealth, a 90-pound woman from China can use stealth to kill Shaquille O'Neal. Nothing against Shaquille O'Neal, right? She can slip some poison into his tea. So we're all equally vulnerable. That's true. Anyone can kill anyone. You get that? Anyone can kill anyone. So second, there is a natural equality of intelligence based in more or less equal experience, bestowing equal understanding in equal times, right? So we have roughly the same experience. Granted, some people are clever at the age of 13, but by the time they're 30, right, experience has equaled them out, even more so by the time they're 40. So people are equal there. So equal in body and equal in mind. So there are effects of equality that Hobbes talks about for us. So the first effect of universal equality is what he calls equality of hope. And this inclines each person to believe himself capable of prevailing in a struggle for something that can be held exclusively by only one person, right? So this is the classic zero-sum game. There's a winner and there's a loser, but both parties are equally hopeful of winning. That puts them into conflict. So there's a quality of hope when expressed in a situation without a common government. That's called a state of nature. This leads to universal mistrust. The word he uses is diffidence. That means mistrust. This motivates persons to perform what today we call the old George W. Bush style preemptive strike against neighbors. Why? Because past experience supports the inference that one's neighbor is likely ill-disposed towards one and will, when presented with the opportunity, take one's possessions, right? So human beings tend to assume the future will resemble the past, and they make decisions on that basis. So consequently, life takes the form of an endless quest of power after power. What's a power? Power means present store against future need. One can never be contented with how much one has at present with respect to food, land, military power, and security in the form of an absence of foreign enemies. So notice this, the impulse then will be to increase one's advantage endlessly in each of these categories. So lo and behold, that from Hobbes' point of view explains the endless quest for world empire. I mean, how many sovereigns have sought to establish a world empire, right? So finally, some reliable minority of persons will take joy in conquest. So beyond the quality of hope and beyond mistrust, they're persons who just like slugging people. They'll take joy in conquest, they'll seek war and repine for the sake of vainglory and the gratification of the ego. Okay, so we have three motives to conflict in the state of nature: desire for gain, mistrust, diffidence, and fear of one another, and finally, vainglory or pride. All right? So the state of nature is therefore a state of war, or what he calls a war of all against all. But by war, he means the mutual acknowledgement over a tract of time of a will to fight. So when you know that your neighbor is willing to fight you, and he knows that you know it, and you know that he knows that you know it, right? And he knows that you're willing to fight him, and you know that he knows it, and he knows that you know that he knows it, right? So at that point, that's a war of all against all. So that's not continuous fighting, okay? But implied in his definition, think about it for a moment, just use common sense. Implied in his definition is that this will to fight will, as a matter of course, through the vagaries of experience, with necessity be actualized in actual fighting, okay? By will to fight, he doesn't mean like a slight will to fight, an active will to fight, okay? Maybe I have a will to fight my neighbor right now, but he doesn't. It's very slight. It's very slight. Okay, so he is clear, because I can't anticipate my neighbor attacking me. My neighbor's a difficult neighbor, but he's not going to attack me physically. He might attack me legally, right? Because he's not going to attack me physically. So he is clear that in this situation, there is not, nor can there be justice. The reason is that without a common power established to overawe every party, there is nothing that can impose or establish the norms of just dealing that are part and parcel of political society. So he has a very positivistic conception of justice. Either there is an authority, it all comes down to a state. Either there is an authority establishing justice, or there's not. If there is, then there's justice. If there's not, there is no justice. Okay. So he rejects the idea of a natural law. Okay, let me back up for a second. He does talk about natural laws, fine. But he rejects the specifically Thomist conception of natural law, where there is a natural prohibition against murder, a natural prohibition against theft, a natural prohibition against perjury, a natural prohibition against adultery. There are requirements for honoring God, that sort of thing. Now, he does introduce natural law later, but that has to do with a law to seek peace and to get out of this situation. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides. So to finish up this description of the state of nature, Hobbes writes, "Whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Leviathan 13. Okay? Now, think historically now. You've all studied a bit of history. Does any period in history answer to what Thomas Hobbes is describing here? I think if you think about it, you'll have a hard time thinking of any time in human history when it was like that. Okay? At least one that's documented. And I guess you would say it wouldn't be documented, would it? But then we have no evidence either way. We have no evidence for it. It doesn't really matter, because this passage can still serve its rhetorical function. It's to give us a negative ideal and to provide us with a kind of image, the realization of which we want to avoid at all costs. And that means that we'll go along with agree to certain principles of political society that can establish and maintain peace, because the alternative is simply too horrible. Now, chances are we'll never get that far, right? We're not going to degenerate to the point of no arts, no letters, no society, and so on, continual fear. But we can take steps in that direction. And so Hobbes' argument is that we shouldn't take even one step in that direction. He's going to include, when you get into his section on moral philosophy, he's going to include even being rude to somebody. You shouldn't even be rude. We should all, he says, never underestimate how much a person values himself or herself. Okay? You always have to keep in mind each person values himself or herself to a point where it's really unreasonable. And it's not just people who are vainglorious want to slug other people. It's everybody. And that's why everybody wants to be, from his point of view, everybody wants to be minimally equal to everyone else. And they can't tolerate not being equal to everyone else. And if Dr. Schick points out a small number of persons who are more concerned with pleasing God and are willing to put up with injustice to please God, such a small number of persons, he would regard them as politically and socially irrelevant. That's interesting he would say that, because from the standpoint of the Vatican, for example, those are the most relevant people. Those are the people you want to imitate. Okay, so let's turn to the solution here. We call it the compact. Each person has an unlimited right in this situation, in the state of nature now, okay? You don't have this right. This is not true of you right now, but if there were a state of nature, like the government were to stop functioning, Hobbes would maintain each person would have an unlimited right of self-defense, and even of offense. That's what's interesting, right? In accordance with one's own conception of what is necessary or what would even conduce to one's self-preservation. Just turn to chapter 14 and have a look at the right of nature. And by the way, he begins with a right of nature before he moves on to a law of nature. Right is first. The individual is first. He separates the individual from the community. The individual is intelligible apart from the community. This is why this is a kind of, is really the foundation of modern liberalism. The individual comes first, in a way. Now, the individual doesn't come first in the sense that he or she has a right to rebel against the government and do what he pleases. That's not true. But in the order of knowledge, we have to think about the individual first, establish his or her right in the state of nature, and then on the basis of that conception, establish a conception of what that person is obligated to do to get out of the state of nature. And what he's obligated to do is going to be related in a way to his right. He has a right to do something for his self-preservation, but precisely because he's oriented towards self-preservation, and comfort comes in later, but precisely because he's oriented towards self-preservation, a law enters, okay? Now, there is a kind of indirect finality. Remember the principle of finality in St. Thomas Aquinas? There's a kind of indirect finality in Thomas Hobbes, the two Thomases, right? In Aquinas, the principle of finality refers to each thing having an actual inbuilt end and purpose, which is good. You get that? For Hobbes, the aim and end of human nature is not to be a mature specimen of the species human being, but rather to stay alive. And that is a goal that one pursues from moment to moment and achieves as best one can, and eventually one loses the battle when one dies. Hopefully of old age, peacefully in bed, right? So, because nature makes it such that one can't help but pursue self-preservation. By the way, that's not really true. People commit suicide. That's a problem for Hobbes' account. But he maintains that we necessarily pursue self-preservation, right? Because that's the case, we are bound by law, the natural law, not by the law of the state. We're bound by the natural law to choose those means which best conduce to one's self-preservation. And by the way, if you disobey that law, you're not being unjust. You're just being irrational. Okay? So there's still no justice in nature from this point of view. So what you should do is seek peace, right? Seek peace and pursue it. He may have been thinking of a psalm there. Seek peace and pursue it. And then make an offer of peace. And if peace is not available, help yourself to all the devices of war, which are force and fraud. So it's one or the other. Seek peace. And if peace is not available at that moment, then you can use force and fraud to get by to the next day. All right? But if someone else offers you terms of peace, accept. Okay? And then you can put an end to the state of war, an end to the war of all against all. So when someone offers peace, you ought to accept that offer. All right? And establish a mutual relationship with that person. But that's actually too small. You want there to be a group of people all agreeing with one another. All who agree to the proposal to establish a civil society, raise your hand and say yay. Everyone raises his hand and says yay, a loud voice. Okay, so now they're bound. So let's look at how this, let's look at the actual form this takes. There are those who enter the contract. By the way, this ends up being called the social contract with Rousseau, who we're not studying in this course. I used to be a big Rousseau fan. I've kind of cooled on him in the meantime. Those who enter the contract agree to obey laws that are established and enforced by another person or persons who is outside of the contract. That's the sovereign. It's persons if it's an aristocracy. It's just one person. It's a monarchy. Okay. So why would he agree to protect them? Well, we already have the answer to that, right? Let's review it. He'll agree to this because he gets paid to do so through taxes. And he can draft some of them to conduct wars of conquest, or at least to protect his territory from invaders, right? Why would the multitude do this? Because it increases the probability of comfortable self-preservation for all. Because after we're able to preserve ourselves, we don't stop there. Then we want pleasure, right? Comfort. So a rational symbiosis of sovereign and people based equally on the enlightened self-interest of each and their different aims, that captures the essence of Hobbes' doctrine. Now, if you're interested in that, turn to chapter, you get your hands on it. Let's go to Project Gutenberg online and look up the Leviathan, read chapter 18. That's where he spells that out. Okay? And that's, he's actually justly famous for that political philosophy. So that then addresses the fear of violent death, which is the most dominating passion in human beings. Okay? And we can know that from our experience of it. From a horror film. I hope nobody actually was ever threatened or anything of that sort, but maybe from a horror film or the imagination or a bad dream, people know that the fear of violent death is the most powerful passion. And so from that basic experience, we can understand, we can bring that basic experience into our reading of Hobbes' philosophy and understand why it's compelling and why so many people, even hundreds of years later, take it as, if not a full statement of the truth, as pretty darn close. And I guess, there are still some hobbyists out there. In philosophy departments, I'd have to think carefully about that. There was a judge, I have his book right here, famous judge. Oh boy, I'm thinking about it. He had an economic theory of law. Everyone knows. Posner, Posner. He seems to be a hobbyist of some sort. So Hobbes is alive and well. The spirit of Hobbes is alive and well. So when you meet a Republican, a kind of conservative Republican who's also an atheist, like if you guys know Ann Coulter, maybe she's before your time, this kind of hard-headed person who believes in the in capitalism and having a big army and maintaining a system of justice and putting people in prison if they break the law and not being lax or lenient on persons who break the law. But it's none of this is based on faith, because they think that effectively God doesn't exist, or they don't know if he exists or not, so they're not going to bother talking about him, and they have a lot of respect for science. Okay? Hobbes is the origin of that sort of modern personality. What he would have looked like in antiquity? Well, there were some hard-headed Romans back then who we can't be certain of it, but some of whom at least were probably skeptical about the existence of the Roman gods. But who's to say with certainty? All right, so that is that. Hope you learned something from that lecture, and I'll see you again on Thursday.